Wonderful. All right, everyone, I've hit the record button, so I now know that we will have a recording. This session will be recorded, so feel free to turn on your video or turn off your video, whatever your comfort level is. And the recording will actually live in the Level Up Your Lettering portal. It's a prep portal. So if you don't have access to that now, I can certainly, actually, I could probably give you the link. I'll try to include that in the show notes. Once it's posted, I'll put that on Facebook or something. Or anyway, what the prep portal is for those of you who have gone through Unlock Your Neuland Markers. And why don't I go ahead and just share my screen real quick. And this will be sort of a pre-show, and then we will have a little bit of an after show for anyone who wants to stay on, because I had a shower thought this morning that I wanted to share if anybody was interested in listening. But I did want to talk about where this recording was going to live. And if you'll notice on your screen, I'm sharing my website, letslettertogether.com. And this is the current lettering curriculum. And we start out with the free Unlock Your Neuland Markers. You can improve your handwriting with how to write like an architect and a sign painter. And then after you've had those, that's when I recommend that you take a Level Up Your Lettering course, whether it's online or one of the 2-day in-person courses. And the reason why I do that is because I've noticed that in some of my classes, I have really advanced people and people who are just starting out. And I want them to feel comfortable in the workshop. And so these are some just basic things that you can take. Actually, I would say you don't even have to take Letter Like a Sign Painter, because we learn that in the workshop. And then there's a few classes that I'm building right now: titles and composition, lettering with the masters. That was last year's big flagship online course. And then the Listen, Letter, Draw Together is something similar to lettering with the masters that I'm building this year. But that Level Up Your Lettering is really the sort of the class of all classes, because we get to letter together in person, and the class pretty much never ends. So you still get to have a one-to-one with me, and you have continued access to me. So the Level Up Your Lettering prep portal will have Unlock Your Neuland Markers in it, and all kinds of free resources that will help you get ready if you want to attend an in-person class. Now, of course, you can attend an in-person class if this is not a requirement, but I highly recommend it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pin or spotlight my video. Am I the only thing you see on your screen? Am I big here? Great. Thank you very much for letting me know. Wanted to invite everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for Lettering Tips Tuesday. We are going to be covering Get Comfy with the Wedge. But before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to keep yourself muted, to cut out any background noise, and unmute yourself if you have a question, or feel free to use the chat room to ask questions, but feel free to interrupt me too, because if I'm writing, I may not see what's happening in the chat. You can open it now by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your window and clicking on that little speech bubble that says chat. Let us know you're here by typing where you're dialing in from. And I also ask that you turn off any distractions that might inhibit you from learning today. So maybe shut off your email if you can. I understand some of you are working as well. So in this session is going to go really fast. And then finally, to make the most out of this session, take a moment to write down what you would like to get out of this session and what question or questions you can ask to help meet your expectation. Meaning, if there's something specific about a wedge nib and while you dialed in, then please let us know. And you can put that in the chat, or you can unmute yourself at any time. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. I have a couple of markers in front of me here, so I will pin. I need to find my camera here. There we go. I will pin this, so you should be seeing my hands. Hold on. I need to mute that. Okay, so you should be seeing my hands and a bunch of markers here. I'm going to be working with some gray markers here, only because I want you to be able to see how my lines overlap when I'm working. I don't recommend graphic recording in these colors of gray. They're wonderful for shadows, drawing with, and also for practicing so you can see where your letters overlap. So we will be using those gray markers today. I'm going to have the big one, the number. So the big one is this one. For those of you who don't already know, the way you open a big one is you hold it in your hand like this, and then with your thumb at the very top, you pop it. and then that pops the top off. So if you find yourself pulling on it like this, you didn't learn that from me. I learned this from Guido. You just pop that top off. That's how you open a big one. We're also going to be working with the number 1 wedge, so that you just pull off, but that's the wedge nib. And then I also have a couple, and I have a couple here, really strange fat ones. This is a hack that I'll be covering in my new book, Lettering Journey. But we're also going to be working with the fat ones. And I do have I have a 50 millimeter fat one. We can talk about that today if anybody has any questions. I don't usually use this for lettering. I usually use it for coloring or creating some kind of banners. And I would use it on great big huge banners if I wanted to letter on them. So we're going to be working with those. And then this bookmark and book plate here is just a reminder for me to remind you and to invite you to my upcoming book launch this Thursday, June 27th. We will be airing at 7, 9, and 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So you may have to do some math there. If you're on my mailing list, you just got an announcement about that. And I'll talk a little bit about that after today's session if you want to. So grab some practice paper and let's talk about the number 1 wedge nib. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of a review. If you've tuned into any of my classes, you've probably seen me draw the anatomy of a wedge nib, but we're going to go over that really quickly just for those of you who are new to the call so that you understand what I'm talking about here. So when I'm referring to this angled side, the very long side, that is called the broad edge. And when I'm talking about this section up here, this very, very top part, that is called the tip. So I'll say point your tip this way or draw with the tip. And this area here is the broad edge of the tip. So you may not write that much with the broad edge of the tip. I will refer to it sometimes on the number 1, but for the big one, you'll definitely use that broad edge of that tip. Now there are some angles here on the nib. I don't really refer to those that much, but you will be using those when you use the broad edge of the nib. That's the part that you're going to be drawing with. You're not going to be drawing with the whole thing, like this whole surface here, just the edge right there. So that when I talk about that broad edge, you're using that angled part. And then down here, this part of the nib, I call that the heel. So think about your heel of your foot. And then the entire thing is called a nib. So that's the anatomy of a wedge nib. So now let's talk a little bit about the marks that those particular parts of the marker make, because that can be really important depending on the lettering style that you're using. So if you were to take your marker and let's point it with the tip up, and you're going to use your entire broad edge of your marker, I mean it's going to be on this side, and oops, this side down here, and it's the angle of it, and just draw a couple of horizontal lines. With the tip of your nib up and this flat on the paper, you're going to get the widest mark that this particular marker can make. Now, if you were to hold it at a 45-degree angle, meaning you're pointing it up and to the left, and you're still using the entire broad edge, you may need to go a little bit slower. But what you're going to notice there is you're going to have that angle. And it should be at the beginning and the end. And this is a good thing to practice because it's going to practice, you're going to be practicing your starts and stops. And starts and stops can be very important. When you want to make confident lines and to have control over your marker. Now, when you're drawing with the tip of your nib, remember this guy right here, you're actually going to flip it down and then draw this way. And you'll notice that it's slightly of a thinner of a line. So this is with the tip of the nib down. All right. And then the final part is the heel. And this is if you were to kick the tip of that nib up and you're just going to write with the bottom part of that. Now, why would you do that? Well, I'll tell you, it's really great if you're trying to write bulleted lines, like lines of text, and then you want a little bitty line in between. You can just flip the marker over and do that. And it could be done with a different color as well. So imagine yourself if you were to draw the letter E using just the broad edge, meaning you would have to change the angle of the marker every time you created a stroke, which this is very similar to Neuland hand. That's the technique we use in Neuland hand. You're going to have a very bold letter. At the same time, it's very slow. And so this is great for titles, but not if you're going to do rapid capture. So what I do is oftentimes I will hold my marker up and to the left, and this is the trick that I like to share people to improve their lettering style. But notice that I'm not going to actually use the entire broad edge this time. This time I'm only going to use about half of it, meaning I am holding the nib down and up and to the left, but I'm only using part of it to write. And I happen to have a very firm grip and a very firm hand, meaning I have a heavy hand, and I use the back of my hand on the paper when I'm writing. And so when I write the letter E, then what I'm going to get is something like this. And the reason why all of my strokes are about the same size is because I'm going up and to the left. I'm also tilting my crossbars up a little bit too, because that tends to be something we do in Sign Painter and something that we do in Architect. So those are the two lettering styles that I frequently use when I'm doing rapid capture using the number 1. Now, if we were to leave the marker, and I'm going to write this over here, if we were to leave the marker pointed at 0 degrees, meaning I'm pointing my nib over here, and I draw an E, I'm going to have thicks and thins. Now, that might be great if I'm doing a great big title chart, a big title, because I want it stylized, but it doesn't give you the control, nor is it very fast if you're doing rapid capture. So in this case, I would not use this style, and I wouldn't hold my marker in that angle if I were doing rapid capture. So for me, rapid capture looks like this. Now, every once in a while, say I'm using a big one, so the big one would be glance, would be a title. Maybe the art marker would be the scan or the subtopics, and then I would use my number 1 to do the read part or the rapid capture. If I wanted to go one size down, I could flip my nib upside down, pointing to the page, and maybe even pointing it up and to the left and writing letters, because notice it's slightly smaller. And then I don't necessarily recommend this, but I did have a student in my Level Up Your Lettering class show me that you can write with the heel of your marker. Now notice that usually if you're writing a lot with the top of the tip like I do, that there's not a lot of ink that flows down here. So if you're using an outliner, it may not work right away. You might have to warm it up a little bit, do a couple of practice strokes to get that ink flowing. So these are some of the ways that we use the different parts of the marker in order to make different letters, different styles of letters. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that later on in the call when we go over some thick and thin. But first I want to show you and do a quick review about Roman. Now, last week we talked about Roman hand and how that applies to, I believe, the round nib. No, it wasn't last week. It was a few weeks ago. And so, but what I want to bring your attention to, and is if you don't have this template, you can get it in the Unlock Your Neuland Markers, my online course. And also what comes with that is the exemplar that goes with that. And so what this is the top part is where I use a fine 1 round nib to write my letters. And the bottom part is where I use the number 1 wedge to write my letters. And what's important to note here is if you're practicing, it's important to have a really good exemplar to look at. We have the superpower of visualization, so might as well use it in order to make great letters. And what you'll notice here is that I've got thicks and thins. And the reason why I have thicks and thins is because I have my marker at an angle. And so now here's another opportunity, and I haven't covered this yet with you. Here's another opportunity to say, okay, if I wanted to put my marker nib down and to the left, and say I wanted to draw a letter O right on this template, I'm going to look at where it starts and it stops up on my exemplar. And in this case, it starts at 11 o'clock and it ends at about 5, holding my marker down, meaning I'm always going to have that angle. I'm going to hold that. I'm not going to turn as I go around the corner. I'm just going to follow that line. And what you're going to notice is I'm going to have, it's not the best O, I'm going to have thick lines here, and I'm going to have thin lines here. And the same goes for the Q. Notice how slow I'm going. We are not practicing to do rapid capture here. We are just practicing our what's called skeleton letter forms, okay? So this is slow, and I will tell you that calligraphers spend a good deal of their life coming back to Roman over and over again. If you're practicing Roman, please practice on these practice sheets. If you're just practicing on regular paper, you're not really noticing how these lines are in relationship to this grid, and this is really important. One of the tips that I offer my students in the in-person class, and you might hear me say this in other places too, is to imagine that grid when you lay down to go to sleep at night. Imagine that grid and draw the letters on top of that grid and how it's in relationship to that grid. And so these are pretty simple letters here, but when we get to something like the letter A, I'm going to start right in the middle, and I'm going to end just outside those inner uprights. Now this, you think, oh my gosh, this is really, really like specific. But what happens is now that I've done this, and that crossbar is a little high there. Now that I've done this, now I know where it is. I'm going to build better muscle memory for when I go live on in front of my client. So again, if you ever feel like, oh, the tops here are getting straight, they're not angled anymore, like if this is too straight here, you can go back up to that mark that you made. And traditionally, calligraphers use a 30% degree or 30-degree angle, but because we're using essentially a sponge on the end of a stick, we're using a marker, it's okay to go 45, and you're gonna get a much deeper angle if you do that. And what this does is it helps you build eye-hand control, muscle memory and eye-hand control. So why do we study Roman if we're never going to use it in graphic recording? Because a couple of things. If you don't have great handwriting and you need to get better at your letter forms, then Roman is going to help you do that. But also because when we get to another lettering style that I call thick thin, and we have two different kinds of thick thin. One of them is in my new book, Lettering Journey. Whoops, sorry about that. And it's written with a big one. And so now I know that if I'm going to work with a big one, I need to have 4, if not 5 nib widths high in order to be able to write my letters. And in this particular lettering style, it's 4 nib widths high. If I go to write a letter, it's going to be based on Roman. But I'm going to do something really special with my hand. I'm going to flip my marker. So again, you can work either flat, but I like again to work at about the 45-degree angle. And I'm going to write the letter E. Actually, I'm going to use one of these back here because E is not as wide of a letter. I'm going to draw my upright, and then I'm going to use the very tip of this nib right here on the very corner of that to write the thin lines that go out. And this has a little bit of a wave, and you're going to get more of this instruction in the book. And also, I have an online course that I'm building that's going to be in conjunction with the book. So that's why we use Roman hand, because it's the basis of a bunch of other letters like thick, thin, brick, and other letters that I'm going to be showing. But it's also the basis of a thick, thin script that I've designed. And so what is thick, thin script? If any of you are familiar with brush letter, meaning if I were to make an A with a brush marker like this, what I've done is, because I had a student that said, hey, I want to be able to make my letters look like brush letter, but I want to do it with a wedge nib. What? So I said, okay, let's try this out. How would this work? Using the different parts of the marker, if we do a downstroke, like if we're doing practice strokes, if we do a downstroke at an angle this way, and then just use the tip of that nib to create an upstroke, we can have thick and thin. So to create an A like that, I'm going to go a little bit bigger because it's a much bigger marker. I'm coming over and down and then using that tip of my nib to come up to make that thin stroke, down with the broad edge, and then up. And if you're interested in learning this lettering style more, I go through the entire lettering style, and I have, I think it's almost 14 pages of practice sheets through Zandra Dirk's website. And let me post that in the chat so you can see it, and I'll be sure to include it in the video as well. So let me get there. Meanwhile, if anybody has any questions, please unmute yourself or ask them in the chat. Looks like we have a question here from Joanna. Thank you for dialing in. I'm so glad to see you. She's saying she would love some advice on what markers to order. She works large on the wall typically, with the exception of a few small templates. She knows that she wants the big ones. Is that something we can use for most all of our wall work? So I would love to give an answer to that, but I'd also love to open that up to anyone else in terms of what are your favorite markers, or what markers do you use the most when you're graphic recording? So if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead, or go ahead and type that in the chat. All right, for those of you that want to just type that in, I will answer the question myself as well. And so for me, of course, I have the whole range of markers, and I'll tell you how those, when I use them and why. So I will use the big one for titles, and what I'm writing here is essentially block lettering, or, oops, sorry about that, Neuland hand. Neuland hand is a lettering style that you can learn from my Unlock Your Neuland markers. That's the 1.0 version. I also have a 2.0 version that's available on Gumroad and on YouTube. So for titles, I'll use the big one. And then every once in a while for, say, subtopics or emphasis, I'll use, yeah, we'll do topics. And thank you to those who are answering in the chat room. Again, this is a version of Neuland hand, but this is the big one tip of the nib. This is the broad edge of the nib. And then we have the art marker. And a lot of times I'll use that for emphasis and for very specific rapid capture. So brush, lettering, I'll use it for sign painter. And sometimes sign painter can become just my rapid capture, but this is the art marker. And I need to explain that that's the number 1 art marker. There is a fine one art marker. Then we have for rapid capture, again, holding my marker up and to the left. So this is how I have control over my lines. And also I really like that up and to the left because it helps give my line variation a nice, it's a nice line variation. It's not thick or thin, it's just, it has a nice transition in those. And so rapid capture, I use the number 1 wedge nib. Excuse my spelling if I mess up. And what I'm looking for now, and I may not have one right at the tip of my fingers, but the number 1 wedge, or also the round, is excellent for your rapid capture. And then we've got the fine one, which is in my hand. So this would be for the fine print or anything that's smaller would be the fine one. And this is the fine one round. There is also, if I can find one, there's also a fine one brush, or it's called art. And this is great for coloring in, shadows, and also I have lettering styles around this too, for those of you who know Twinkle. And you can also do brush letter with it, though it's a little bit harder. And then And so this could be used for the fine print if you're doing a graphic recording or working on a flip chart, but it's also great for sketchnoting. And then the other pen or marker that's also excellent for sketchnoting, and now I don't have one on the tip of my hands. Oh, here we go. This one's really tiny. This is a .01, is the Sketch one. Now this one's really tiny. The Sketch one comes in .01, 03, 05, and 07. So these two are great for sketch notes, or if you're working on, say, an 11 by 17 or 8.5 by 11 to do templates. You go a little bit bigger, I would say from here on up is going to be for graphic recording, like big charts. And you could still do all of these for flip charts, but I would say this is probably more appropriate for flip charts. And then the one marker that I didn't include would be the fat one, which would also be for graphic recording. So hopefully, Joanna, does that answer your question about all the different markers and when I would use them? This is really sort of the spectrum of use here.
Yes, that helps. Thank you. I think I was trying to, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I think I was wondering how much we could use the big one without having to put it down and grab another one. But I also realized that I don't have one yet. They're pretty big to hold, and I don't know how that affects things as well.
Yes, so some people in our field love how big they are. Brandy and Kelvy love how big they are. I do too, but they're not as fast because they're big. And so what happens is when we end up using lettering styles with the big one and with the fat one, it's slower because we're making bigger strokes. It's a bigger marker. And if you take any of my classes, you'll know that I always say, let the marker do the heavy lifting. And so let the big one and the fat one make those big letters. And because the number one is so much lighter, it's easier in the hand, whether you're using the number one wedge, round nib, or marker or art marker, it's just going to be faster. So with the big one, I mean, if we think about physical, like body mechanics, we're using our shoulder and our elbows to write with the big one and the fat one. We end up using our wrists and our fingers more because it's faster to write with the number one. And so also the number one is a similar size to the charter marker. So if you're a charter user, or if you use Crayola or Copic or any of those others, those markers, because they're smaller, they're going to be much faster to use and probably more comfortable as well. Yeah, good, good. If you have any other questions, go ahead and unmute yourself or ask in the chat. We have a few more here. This is from Emer. Wanted to know if there's a lettering style for number one to use with rapid capture. And I say yes, of course, the number one, and I'm assuming you're saying the number one wedge. For those of you who have taken my courses, you know that in Architect, I say use the round marker, the round nib. And if you're taking Sign Painter, use the art marker. But guess what? We can create Architect using the wedge, and we can also do Sign Painter using the wedge. And if you'll notice, I'm not even using any lines here to write, so may not be totally straight. But what I'm doing as I'm writing is I'm thinking about the attributes of those lettering styles. We know that the Architect is based on a square with a, and this little line down here isn't necessarily an X height, but it tells us where things live in relationship to the box. We know that all of the uprights are completely vertical, that it's based on an oval, and that most of the lines, the crossbars, all go up and to the right. And that makes it a fast lettering style. It's also extremely legible. There's an uppercase and a lowercase version of that. And so I write Architect with the number one wedge nib if it's in my hand. And with the Sign Painter, we know that the attributes for Sign Painter, it's usually written with a brush, the broad edge of the brush. It is written at a slope that is consistent. We also know that the crossbars, those as well, go a little bit up and to the right if we're making like an E. So in there, that letter is usually a little bit thinner, whereas Architect is based on the square. And again, that's also a very fast lettering style because it's got that slope. you'll get this rhythm going. What you have to be mindful of, though, because sign painter is a little bit more advanced, mainly because if you're writing with an art marker, it does take some finesse, that you write in a straight line. Sometimes we tend to go down when we're sloping forward, so that's important to do as well. Okay, so Emer, does that answer your question? So that's how I usually write when I'm writing with my #1 wedge. I'm either writing an architect, sign painter, or if I'm going so fast that I'm not meaning to do either one of these, my natural handwriting has been influenced by both of these lettering styles. I've separated them out so that people can learn them separately. But when I'm writing my just my rapid capture as fast as I can with #1, it is sort of a culmination between these two and Roman hand. Okay, so Angelique, thank you for joining the call. She says, I used to just use #1s for most work, but I've incorporated big ones and find them incredibly versatile for most work with the outliner for small, super heavy text work. Yep, that's right, smaller. So when you say the outliner, I'm assuming you're talking about this fine one for the smaller, or maybe even the outliner, this one. I use outliners almost specifically to capture all of my text. I stopped buying the black, just the regular black, because I was confused on when do I use what, when. So I use outliners all the time. In fact, predominantly my whole box has anywhere from 3 to 5 of each outliner in each one of the different sizes, and then I have color to go along with it. And the outliner works great both with all of the other markers. For those of you, if this is your first call, and you may not know this, but if you have an outliner and you write it down and then you try to go over it with another color, and I love to show it with yellow, then what happens is it won't bleed. It won't bleed into that other color. If you're using just a regular black marker, it will smear and bleed and contaminate the nib of your other colors. So that's why I use the outliner, so I never have to worry about changing that up and using other colors. All right. Thank you, Gray, for dialing in. He had a chance to try the Sharpie brush tips. They're a lot of fun, but he tends to prefer Neuland for the refillability. Yeah, I agree. I think I have one only because I use it sometimes when I address envelopes, because I know that they're going to go through the mail and I wouldn't want them to get wet. And it's usually when I'm writing on a plastic envelope. So just a quick, since we're already here, I just opened this up and I can smell it. So Sharpies, we know smell. Some people like the smell. I'm not crazy about it. Their nibs are wonderful, I have to admit. And for me, they last for about a half an hour and then they're dead. And again, I just use these sometimes for addressing envelopes, but they do make a very comparable they have the flexibility. They are a smaller nib. You'll notice how much smaller that nib is, and that will make a difference. And then it's a little bit more flexible, but it also doesn't last as long. And we know that Sharpies aren't refillable, neither ink nor nibs. So you can refill your Sharpie marker nibs as well. So thanks for adding that. Okay, great, Emer. You're wondering if there's something other than sign painter and architect. Yeah, so a good lowercase style. So architect does come in lowercase. I know you said that you're not crazy about it. In my, let's see, How to Letter Like a Sign Painter book, and I know you have this, Emer, on page, let's see, page 18, I wrote casual hand minuscules because this is literally my handwriting lowercase. And I wouldn't say that it's based on architect, but there are some things in here that are similar. My handwriting is better for it. My A is very, very different. But I think when it comes to rapid capture, we rely a lot on our handwriting. And for me, having that architect and sign painter has influenced it, and so has Roman hand. And so what I would say is when you're practicing, the best advice that I would have to give is to find the letters that you love that you write and check those off and say, okay, I want to see if I can make some of my other letters look like this. And so this is about finding the strength of your own handwriting and improving on that. But no, I don't have anything other than those two for the #1. If anybody else does, please chime in. I'd love to hear what you use as well. Okay, Chantel, you were saying the marker that I was using for rapid capture was that number 1. It's the number 1 wedge. All right. Great. I'm glad to hear that the sign painter course inspired you to use more brush tips. That's great. Yes. So, Joanna, the colors bleeding and smearing into each other, that can definitely happen for 2 reasons. If they're super juicy, and I'm going to put a light color down first because I don't want to contaminate that, and that's probably dry by now. And then that's pretty wet too. You're going to see some bleeding in there, and the juicier they are, the more bleeding you're going to get. But that's not too bad, actually. And we're looking at it super, super up close. Remember that most of the people that are looking at your charts are across the room. So if something looks good from at least arm lengths away, then you know it's going to be fine. So don't be so critical of yourself when you start writing. I know that when I first started teaching Neuland Hand, people were so focused on the form, which I'm very grateful for. I'm going to see if I can find a nib that's a little bit more chewed up. No, that one looks pretty good. My nibs are in pretty good shape, people. That's good. That's not always the case. Anyway, I'll see if I can do it here. You can kind of see on the beginning and the ends of that line that there's just a little bit of scratchiness. That is so minor. And some of my students see that and go, oh no, how do I make that cleaner? And I remind them that this is a nylon nib, and there's fibers in there. We're not working with a steel edge pen or anything like that. So it's okay. So there might be some bleeding. Again, that's going to depend on how juicy your markers are, but from far away, I think it'll probably look fine. I would say though that if you are going to layer color on purpose, start with lighter colors and work your way up to darker colors. A lot of times I like to start with a 500 yellow, which is a beautiful color. The reason why I use 500, I don't have many other yellows in my palette, is because, oh, and this guy is really, really dry. It might be out of ink completely. I think so. Mainly use that for demoing my, my hack. Okay, I'm trying to pin my video again. Let's see. I probably have 5 of these 500s in my bag. This is not 500, this is slightly lighter. But the reason why I like 500 is because you can put so many other colors on top of it, and it can go either on the warm side or the cool side. And what I mean by that is that you can put orange, you can put 601 red orange, which is my personal favorite color, and then red, which is 200, and then you can go the other way and say, oh, well, if it's yellow, I can also go cool colors like green and ocean and blue. But just know that what I've noticed is that if I use this color on a title, which is really fun to be able to put different fills and things like that in, that the color is going to, if you notice this blue down here looks slightly different than the blue that's up there. That doesn't bother me, but if that really bothers you, just keep in mind that you are going to have some variations in color there. All right, more questions. This is great. You want some tips about how to use the acrylic wedge nib as well. Is there any difference compared to the big one? Yes, there's a big difference between those two. Let me see, I'll grab one of the acrylics. So the rule with the acrylics, there's a couple. The important thing is that you shake it a lot. So I'm gonna shake this for a little while. I usually shake them for about 2 minutes. A great way to shake them, and I learned this from, hold on a second, let's really shake it. If you don't hear the little marbles, there's 2 very, very small marbles in there. If you don't hear those in there, then they're probably stuck either to the side, at the top. So you want to be able to shake them really, really well. And the reason why there's marbles in there is that this is high flow acrylic paint. And high flow acrylic paint does need to be mixed. Now, when you first get your fat one, you'll have a marble in there. You'll hear it. I usually take those out. This one was actually given to me already filled. The reason why I take those out is because when we're putting Neuland markers or Neuland ink in the markers, Neuland ink itself is water-based as well, but it's not a paint, so it doesn't need to be mixed. The next thing that you need to keep in mind is that and I twist these as I open them, and I twist them with my hand on this part, because if you twist it over here, this whole piece could unscrew. These are refillable and the nibs are replaceable. And this one's pretty rounded off because I used it a lot. I just had a gig where I did all outliner markers and acrylic. So that's all I was doing was black and white and pops of color. The next thing you need to do is you need to pump it. And this one's already pretty juicy, so I'm not going to pump it a bunch, but you need to pump it until you get a nice flow going. And so the difference between the acrylic and the big one is a couple of things. First of all, it's got a flat broad edge, just like the fat ones, whereas the big one has an angled edge, and there's a big difference there. I'll be showing on Thursday at the 11 Mountain Daylight Time. I'm going to be showing how to hold this particular marker, the wedge nib marker, in different directions for particular letters so that they're going to look really, really good in the lettering styles I'm going to show you. But also notice that they're different widths. Not a lot, but it's still there. And you're also going to get a little extra ink flow on the acrylic as well. So the acrylic, it says it's an 8 to 15 millimeter. That 8 is that broad edge of this side. And honestly, I think it's the entire broad edge, not including those little angles. And so if you were to use the broad edge of that side, now you've got a whole nother, width there that you can work with. So again, going back to that thick, thin script, notice it's starting to look a little brushy. Sometimes on an opposite, like on a piece of paper somewhere else, I'll have this little pool of ink that I can dip back into if I need to. This marker is not like ready to go right out of the box. But what this marker is great for is if you're working on gator board, foam core, eagle cell, and the gator board and the eagle cell are the most environmentally friendly. I don't use foam core anymore. But they're great for that because they don't soak in. They actually lay right on top of the paper. And I like using it on the Neuland black and brown papers as well. But you can do these lettering styles that I was telling you about with this broad edge marker as well. You can also do it with the fat one. And the fat one also needs to be pumped. We'll see how juicy this is because the ink, yep, it's not juicy at all. Because the ink in the fat one is the Neuland water-based ink, it tends to be really, really watery. So you have to be careful, and you have to pump horizontally before you go to the wall. Otherwise, you're going to have a waterfall. So again, I'm using that broad edge to make these really broad lines, and then I'm just using the very tip, not the side, but the very tip to create the thinner lines. Okay, so like the letter A, be something like this. You can play with the crossbar. You can even add serifs to it if you want in different places. All right. So does that answer questions about acrylic and broad edge? If you have any more, just unmute yourself. Okay, is there a store here in the US that sells Neuland? Not currently, and I don't have any information about who would be selling in the future. So I don't know. Maybe that's a request that we can put into Neuland. It would certainly help on some shipping, huh? Okay. All right, what kind of blue is the one that looks a bit different on the camera? Oh, yes, so that blue is the 302. But since we're talking about that, let's play with a couple of colors. So what would some of the colors look like if they went over that? So and we'll use a couple of different blues. So first we did the 302. And any color that you draw over another color is going to look slightly different, right? So remember the idea that yellow and blue make green. So any colors of blue that you're going to write on top of that are going to shift slightly. Those are all the blues that I have right close to at hand. But that doesn't bother me so much if it's just in the title and then one other place. Does anybody else like to layer colors? Excellent question about when nibs should be replaced. You found some nibs that get super soft fast, not sure if it's how you're using the pen or if you have noticed variations in Neuland and nib fibers. Yes, absolutely. So I can definitely answer the nib, when to replace your nib question. So a couple of things. If you're anything like me, when it comes to a pair of shoes, when you first get the pair of shoes, they're stiff, they hurt, then you wear them for a while, and then they're awesome. And then there's going to be a point in which they're just terrible and they start falling apart and they're not comfy anymore. Well, the nibs go through the exact same thing. And here's what I've noticed about the big one. So the big one has a veneer on both sides of the nib, and that's what helps keep it together and straight and really nice. But on the top and on these two sides, there is no veneer. And so what happens a lot of times, if you're a heavy-handed person, meaning you push down really hard when you're using your marker, and if for some reason you don't have a lot of juice in your marker, then what will happen is you will have the tendency to crush your nib to try to get more ink to come out of it. And if you do that, what happens is you're pushing the nib in one direction, and because there's no ink in there, ink will act like a lubricant. And so if there's not a lot of ink in there, then you're literally crushing those fibers and it's going to start wearing that nib down faster. And so something that you can do for your marker is to keep ink in your marker. Now, Neuland recommends that you wait until it goes dry because they don't want you to overfill your markers because your markers will then leak because you have no idea how full it is if it's always pointing down. And so I do let my markers go dry, and then as soon as they go dry, if I feel like they're going dry, then I immediately stop using it. Or I just know that if I crush the nib, then I'm going to have to replace it sooner. And so keeping ink in your markers will be helpful. For the brush nib, very similar to, well, actually, this is true for any nib, that if you're trying to crush it to get the ink out, it's because you need to put ink in. But for the art marker, when you first get it, your brand new nib is going to be shaped somewhat like this. And after you've used it a little while, if you are putting your thumb and your forefinger and using these grooves, then what you're going to do is you're going to develop this little belly underneath, because what you've done is you've started to crush. Again, you're pushing, pushing, pushing. The top will stay flat and the bottom will start to create a little belly. And I'm going to look for a marker that has that because I want to show you a trick. This may be, nope, that's a round nib. I may not find one. I was really good last month and I replaced all of my nibs. Okay, this one's a little shoddy. If you've taken my how to letter like a sign painter or level up course, you know that after we fill in about 5 or 6 pages using the ocean marker, that it will start to develop this little belly because we're using it so much. And so what I've noticed is that if I'm writing, and I'm going to go ahead and write sign, and notice how thick that is. This is a pretty mushy nib. If I flip it over, meaning I'm literally just using the opposite side, so now I'm writing with this side, I can write smaller, and I'm not even changing the pressure. It's just, it will write smaller because that part of the nib isn't as flexible. It's not as mushy anymore. It doesn't have that same belly. So if you find that you're working and you're like, oh, my letters are really big and mushy, just flip your marker over. Or I have a student that doesn't like the ergonomic grips for her. She just doesn't like how they feel in her hand. And so she fills them up and then tapes over her marker. And as she writes, and she does this with the round one, I believe, she just moves the marker as she goes, or she doesn't have that orientation, so she's always picking it up and using it from a different angle anyway, and that will help at least even out your nibs as well. And so all of these are replaceable. The one that's interesting is the one that's in the fine one. This is two-sided, and so you can actually use one side and then push it through, and then use the good side to push it through this way, and then press on it to get it the right length. So if you notice on this one, this is kind of funny. This side already has a little bit of a curve to it, and this one is totally straight. And so when I go to use this next time, I'll probably just flip this nib around. So it's the round nibs that can be used twice. All right. What other questions do you have? Okay, Julian, you were asking about 305. It looks a bit different. Were you referring to the color? Julian, you may be muted if you're trying to answer me, but you were asking about the 305.
Yeah, I was asking about that because it looks a bit different, but
Yeah.
might be just the camera. So yeah.
Yeah, it could be the camera, the lighting. I have a couple of different lighting in here. I've got
Yeah,
tungsten
yeah.
and natural light. That's also the
It's a bit
301.
darker, and I was curious if it's the original 305 or somehow it was like blended with some other.
No, if I'm gonna blend my markers, blend my inks, I use an empty marker, or I will actually mark the marker with a sticker
Cool.
so that I know
Yeah.
that I've done something to it. But no, this is the 305, and that's actually over 501. And I don't use 501 often. I think I accidentally did it. I was teaching a class and I put 501 in the yellow marker, but I use 501 to actually mix my inks. So if I'm going to mix a color, I'm going to use 501. Ooh, I don't know that I have that in front of me, but 501 is the yellow that I mix other colors with, because 500 has a little bit of orange in it, and so it's a bit of a contaminant color,
Mhm.
which means it's already mixed and it already has its own sort of mix to it, but the 501 is pretty pure yellow. Yep. But yeah, that's the 305.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah. All right. Could you type the brand names of the alternatives to foam core in the chat? Oh yeah, absolutely. Let's see. One kind of substrate that I use is called Eagle Cell. I really like this because it's really, really hard. It's very sturdy. You can get it in a thin piece and it doesn't warp like foam core does. And Eagle Cell has almost like this honeycomb corrugation going opposite of the way of like cardboard. And so it's really nice. It has a really nice finish on it. I don't believe it's a clay finish, but it's a smooth finish, and it holds I haven't used regular water-based ink on it, but I use the outliner, and it works great with the outliner, and also it works really great with the acrylics. And then the other one is called Gator board, and I think I spelled it wrong. I think it's Gator board. And so Gator board is not as fun to work with for a couple of reasons. It's a little bit heavier than Eagle Cell. Actually, it's a lot heavier than Eagle Cell. And you can't, if you cut it, it snaps and you're done. Whereas foam core, if you had a great big huge piece of foam core and you wanted to fold it up and take it with you to a gig, so sometimes if you have a 1/2 inch foam core, what you can do is you can Z fold it, meaning you score it on one side, score it on the other, and create this Z fold so that you can carry it to your gig. You can't do that with Gator board. As soon as you cut into it, it snaps and you're done because the fibers are really, really thick in there. I don't know how environmentally friendly Gator board is. I know that it's an alternative, but Eagle Cell is environmentally friendly. It's recycled and it's recyclable. So, yep. All right. If the title is in blue and highlight at the end, will it infect the yellow nib? A little bit, probably. That's okay. Not a big deal. So a lot of times what I'll do, and I do a yellow letter with a blue fill over doing a blue letter with a yellow highlight. But if I were going to do it in that order, if I were to create a letter, and I'm just going to do a letter I because it's fast and it's easy, I would probably outline it with black for a couple of reasons. One, it helps define the shape. And for a color that's as dark as this blue, you're not really going to see the black anyway. But in that case, what would happen is when I go to highlight, and this isn't actually a yellow, it's sort of the yellow green, it's the 503. If I were to go back to highlight, and I'll just do this up here, my yellow is touching the black rather than the blue. So it's a little bit protected in there. And look, I don't have any contamination. There's nothing on my nib that's contaminated by the blue. So outlining in black is always nice just to give it some definition. And then of course to protect your lighter colors from the darker colors. Yeah. And do I need a backup for each color? Yeah, I do. Yeah, the store-bought ones do dry out quick. I don't use those anymore. I just use Neuland. But so I have in my bag, I have 2 to 3 of the exact same marker in the color that I want. And the reason why I do that is because I don't like to travel with ink, not for any other reason than I want the space for other things. So I'll just take more markers, and I haven't had an issue with that. So yeah, that's how I do it. And then am I using the empty fat one with water-based ink? So yes, so the empty fat ones, I use all kinds of different inks in these. I use Neuland for when I'm graphic recording. I make my own walnut ink for when I'm doing calligraphy. I mix acrylic, the high flow acrylic. So Neuland has refills as well for their acrylics. And so a lot of times I'll mix my own colors, and I'll put that in the fat ones. And that's when I do leave the marble in there. So yeah, I use all kinds of different inks. And the rule of thumb for using inks in empty markers or the aquash markers, those are the watercolor markers that people usually put water in and then just dip it into their watercolor pans and then go back through. I actually put ink in those as well, and I've put Neuland ink in them, and fountain pen ink. Fountain pen ink is wonderful to put in empty markers, because if it can go through a fountain pen, it can go through and go through these foam markers really well as well. Yeah. Have I had any TSA issues with fat ones as carry-ons due to the large chamber? I haven't, but it makes sense that you would. So a couple of things that I do, and you'll notice on all of these markers, there's barely any ink in here. And so when you take my class, I say, we're not going to use a lot. We're going to share these anyway, so we don't fill them up all the way. Plus, if something were to happen, like I had a student in my class in Germany that twisted this the wrong way and he broke the whole top off. And so if for some reason, if this broke and decided to leak, then you would lose a lot of ink. And so you'll notice I don't have a lot of ink in my fat ones. In fact, this one we noticed was dry earlier. This one probably has a lot in it because it was given to me. It's actually 101 gray, and it's all the way up here. And I don't use it very much just because it's gray. So I would say for TSA, I would not put a lot of ink in it. And if you're really worried about it, pack it really well, like in bubble wrap or between socks or whatever, and put it in your checked luggage if you're comfortable with that. Does the foam tip dry out easily? That's a really great question. I think it depends on where you live. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I felt like I never had to pump these things. But I live in Colorado, and I feel like I need to pump my markers, especially my acrylic markers. I feel like I'm shaking and pumping those the whole time I'm using them. It's very dry here. We have literally like 0% humidity some days, and my markers dry up. And I store a lot of my markers in plastic because they dry up, not because they leak, but because they dry. So I think it all depends on where you live. And if you live in a humid climate, you may not go through your ink as quickly. I felt like I didn't ink my markers very much when I was living in Washington, D.C., but now that I'm in Colorado, I have to ink my markers regularly, and I definitely ink them before every single gig. Yep. All right. Any other questions? Wow, you guys filled me up with questions. Let's see if I have anything left on my agenda. We talked a little bit about Roman hand, Neuland hand. If you take my Unlock Your Neuland Markers video series, or you can go to neuland.com/hand lettering and download this exemplar of Neuland hand. This is my Neuland 1.0 hand. I have, like I said before, I have an entire 2.0, which is not as mechanical. It's a little bit more loose. It's fun. And I talk about different markers that you can write Neuland hand with and what that looks like. But the idea with Neuland hand is that you are using the broad edge of the marker all the time. And so what that means is you're constantly changing, and I'm going to go ahead and make 4 nib widths high. You're constantly changing the angle of the marker, which is opposite of Roman hand, where we kept the angle the same the entire time. Okay? So notice that every time I make a mark, I'm pretending like there's a wheel on each side of this nib, and I'm making sure that both wheels are on the ground at all times. And so Neuland hand is one where you change the angle all the time because you're always trying to get that broad edge. And then the thick thin script, I think I may have already, but if I didn't already, I'm going to paste the thick thin script in the chat. so that you have that. You'll see a video there. It's with Zandra Dirks and I. At the very beginning of the video, she is speaking in German, but don't be afraid. The rest of the session is in English. She switches to German every once in a while. So, yeah, so check that out. And there's a download there with several pages of practice pages, so you can see how I broke the letters down. You can practice right along with it. And I believe there's some uppercase and numerals with those as well. And feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to talk a little bit about any of these lettering styles. And I want to do a quick after show. So we answered the what markers you would buy. If you have any specific questions, Joanna, around the markers, let me know. But I did give you a sneak peek into the clock face, and I just wanted to show you that particular chapter in my new book, Lettering Journey. And let me pin this video so that you can see just me. You should be able to see me. There are 2 versions of the book. I will be talking about that this Thursday. But I wanted to show you clock face and all of the different variations around that. So clock face was literally inspired by a clock museum that I went to when I was in Portland, Oregon. I talk about the different anatomy of a marker nib and the different parts of the marker that I showed you earlier that you actually write with. And then the entire lettering style is written out for you, including a ductus, which lines to draw first, in what direction. It's different for lefties. And I go over numbers. And then I also talk about that thick-thin script. So this is a variation. This is what I was showing you a little bit earlier, using the thick and thin parts, and it's based on the brush letter form. So if you take the brush lettering video in the Unlock Your Neuland Markers, you'll see that. Where there's also, this is a variation that's inspired by Ben Shahn, who this was his poster lettering style. And then this particular variation here is actually hand drawn. And so all of these black lines are drawn with a fine one. And then I just filled in the inside with gray so you can see that it's the thick and thin. So it's the whole idea of using the thick part of the marker and the thin part of the marker to create the letter and just have a different variation. That's great for emphasis. This book was inspired by a road trip that I took shortly after leaving Washington, D.C. And it was because I was getting so many requests from people wanting to have title variations. And so there's 7 different lettering styles in there that show titles. And then I just touch on architect. So there you have it. Any additional questions for me about the wedge nib? Did I answer those? Looking back at the beginning of the call when I said take a moment and write down a question, what you'd like to learn out of this. Did anybody still have a question that hasn't been answered? Is there a preferred vendor for purchasing your book? Not at all, because I'll get paid no matter what. So I will talk on Thursday where to find those, and I'll be giving out links. Those will become live at 7 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, maybe a little bit before. So you'll be able to find my book anywhere books are sold. I have an ISBN number. I went through Ingram Spark, which means you'll be able to get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and some other places that you will be able to get it through Neuland. And also I'll have a page too. If you want it signed, I'll give you a link for if you want your book signed. If you end up buying it somewhere else and you want a book plate, at the front of the book, there's a space for me to sign, and I will give you a customized book plate. And I can mail that to you. So you don't have to send me the book or anything. You can just send me your address and I will mail you a book plate that you can put in your own book. All right, any other questions? Well, we're at the top of the hour. I hope you've enjoyed working with the wedge nib markers, the number 1, the fat one, and the big one. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me, either my email address, heather@heathermartinez.com, or I'm on social media tons. So if you ask a question on social media, chances are someone will benefit from the answer. So I appreciate you tuning in today.